And that's you?
Mm-hmm. I'm Peter. My name is John Dietrich. I started life as Detre János, because in Hungary they have the surname first and the first name second. I was born in Budapest, and I was born in 1947, a momentous date of 16th of June. Vera, Gabi,
Who's
Jane.
that?
That's Andrew.
So, Jani, why did you want to make this film, and who are you making it for?
Basically, there are aspects to my family's life that only I know. I've built up the family tree for both my parents as far as I can, and I'm leaving that for the next generation. But there are stories relating to the way we left Hungary, the way we arrived in England, the way we settled down in England that, frankly, only I know, because only my parents and my brother knew, and sadly none of those people are with us anymore. My parents and my grandparents were a product of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in that my father's family came partly from Austria and partly from what is now the Czech Republic, from a place called Brunn. My mother's family were mainly from different parts of Hungary, but both of my parents were born in Budapest and grew up in Budapest. Both my grandfathers, both my mother's and my father's fathers, died when they were young. My father's father died and left his mother with 5 children, and it was thanks to his oldest brother Fritzi, who went out to get a job and looked after the 5 children, the mother, and of course the housemaid, which you had to have in those days, and made sure that they had a reasonable standard of life. So that's how my father started. My father belonged to a fairly upmarket rowing club on the Danube near Margitsziget, and he loved this rowing club. And it was at a dance at the rowing club that my parents met.
It's a really sad thing, isn't it, that both your father's father died when your father was young, and I think your mother's father died when she was quite young also.
My mother's father died when she was quite young, and left behind a young widow who was ill-equipped to look after 3 young children. And her whole life was saved because she had a sister called Ida, known to all of us as Dushi. And Dushi was the one whose elderly husband supported the family and effectively brought up the children. My grandmother was not very good at looking after children. She liked to go out in the evening and play cards with her friends, and who knows, might even have had a drink or two. And then she'd wake up at 11, 12 o'clock, by which time, of course, the children would have had to go to school and be brought up. They were brought up partly by nannies and women who were supposed to be teaching them. And these were not particularly pleasant people, and they weren't kept under control by anybody. So to a great extent, my mother looked after her younger sister, Zsuzsi, Susan, and Jacques, whose name was Jóska.
Would you say that the families were well-off families, or?
I've never ever heard of the family having serious debt. I think they were all of modest financial background, but as far as I can understand it, they always managed to just about make ends meet. My parents, even when they were living in England, would never ever buy anything on hire purchase. Their view was, you either buy it because you can afford it, or you don't buy it. So they would only buy a TV once they had the money in the bank. And I think that was their attitude from a young days. And they were never well off, any of them, but they managed to make ends meet.
But your grandmothers, who lost her husband young, they had a couple of nightclubs, didn't they? Or?
They had a nightclub, but I don't know exactly what happened to it. It was run by my great-grandmother, and it was her domain, and I don't know much about her, and I don't know what happened to the nightclub. I suspect that it was something that went bust. And
they lost during the war, possibly.
something like that. So,
And your father's family, they were in textiles for quite a long time, weren't they?
my father's family were in textiles. Both my uncle Fritzi and his brother Erwin had a small textile factory, which I'll talk about in a minute. And my cousin Gobby is still, at the age of 83, still selling textiles. And I was involved in selling textiles for quite a long time. So it kind of runs in the blood. Some people have blue blood. I have wool in my veins.
But one of your cousins, Tony, I think it was, says that he thinks, although your parents may have met at a dance at the rowing club, that they were actually spent an illicit summer together in 1944 at a place called Angora, and I wondered whether that was something to do with the textile industry.
No, that was to do with the war. They were hiding.
Why were they hiding?
My mother was already pregnant with my brother Peter, and they were hidden there to safeguard them, so that if the Nazis came, they wouldn't be found, to protect both of them.
You've alluded to the fact that your parents were in hiding in 1944. Why was that?
This is during the Second World War, when the Jews were persecuted. About 600,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered. They stayed in Budapest, and part of the time their whole life was saved because my mother's cousin, who I call an uncle, worked for the Swedish embassy and managed to get members of the family into a house which is protected by Raoul Wallenberg, this famous Swedish diplomat. And he designated, I think, 33 houses were under the protection of the Swedish government. In theory, this had no real protection value, but the Germans seemed to accept it and recognize it, and it saved my parents' lives towards the end of the war. They ended up in a house full of people. You can imagine a house where 5 or 6 people per room, and they just managed to survive and live through to the end of the war. Not every member of my family have lived through the war. Some of my father's cousins perished. I know of at least 6 in German concentration camps.
So, going back to one of the Wallenberg houses where your parents were, then before your brother was born, your mother was very pregnant. Must have been very difficult and very frightening for them being in that house, not knowing if at any time these thugs, these Arrow Cross right-wing Hungarian approved government thugs were going to break in.
That's perfectly right, and they did break into some of the houses. I'm not totally clear on whether they broke into the house that my parents were in. The only other person who remembers any of these stories, and I'm grateful to him for some of the stories that I'm going to tell, is my cousin Tony, who at the age of 83 is still alive in Canada and has a clear memory. So anything that I talk about in terms of those periods is thanks to the stories that he sent me over a period of time. It would appear that one day they broke into the house that my parents were in. They were marched down to the Danube. They were lined up next to the Danube, ready to be shot. And this had happened many, many times. But it appears that for one reason or another, whether it was an intervention by the Swedes or something else, this particular group that my parents were in were not shot and were allowed to go. And of course, if they had not been allowed to do that, I wouldn't be here now.
I mean, you've mentioned to me in passing that there's a very poignant installation on the banks of the Danube of 60 pairs of bronze shoes where these people, these Arrow Cross thugs, because it wasn't the Nazis who shot those Jews, it was actually Hungarians, and they made everybody take their shoes off because shoes were valuable, but they took the laces out of the shoes and tied the children's wrists to their parents and then shot the parents and pushed them in the Danube. So the children were alive when they pushed them in the Danube, which just doesn't bear thinking about.
Well, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but when people talk about that the Holocaust didn't happen, I know that it did, because I have firsthand. I have other members of the family who ended up in camps. I have an uncle who was a dentist, and because he was a dentist, he survived Mauthausen. But I don't spend any more time on this. I think we ought to move on.
So that was your parents. They survived the war, which was a great blessing. And Peter was born on the Ides of March.
He was.
In 1945, and very sadly Ralph Wallenberg disappeared on the 17th of January in that year when the Soviets took Budapest, broke the siege of Budapest, but took Raoul, and he was never seen again, and it's believed he was executed 2 years later when he was just 33. That is your sort of heritage, and you've talked about your father and your mother. Tell us, before you move on to leaving Budapest, and what made your parents leave Budapest.
Before we do that, I just want to say I can remember 2 homes that we lived in. In Hungary, the Buda is a hilly, residential, smarter side, and Pest is more commercial and industrial side. We lived in Buda all the way through, and the first house we lived in was on the hill. And we had a small apartment on the ground floor, and there are stories of us being put outside to sit in the sun. In the house next door was a very senior government minister, and he had security guards outside the house, and my brother was 2 or 3 years old, and he heard a joke. And he decided to tell this joke to the security guards. And the story was that the Prime Minister, Rákosi, was walking down the street, and he had a big bald head. And this bird fell out of the tree and fell onto his head. And the Prime Minister reached up and pulled the little bird down and said, little bird, are you okay? So the little bird said, yes, I'm okay, because I fell on an arse. Well, I can tell you, my parents thought that the secret police would pick them up any day, and for the next month or 2, they were so scared, because clearly you're not allowed to tell political jokes. That was the first remembrance. We then moved to a bigger flat in the center of Buda, in Keleti Károly, and my school was nearby, and we used to ride the sleigh down the hillside. And one day we went out with my brother Peter, one of my friends and I must have been about, I don't know exactly, 5 or 6. And Peter was about 7 or 8. And we went down this very steep slope in the sleigh, and I was in front, my friend was in the middle, and Peter was in the back steering. And we hit a brick wall. And of course I fell out the sleigh, and with hindsight I was concussed. And, clearly Peter was very worried and very concerned about this. And so he sort of walked me around the streets for 2-3 hours, hoping I'd get better. Well, that's not the way to treat concussion, but fortunately, again, I survived, but it was no thanks to that.
Do you remember your childhood in Buda as being a happy one, despite the fact it was the post-war years, was there?
Throughout our whole life, my parents worked very hard not to share all the problems that they had. For example, my father worked in a textile factory a long way away, and he had to leave house between 6 and 6:30 in the morning to get there in time to start working. He was number 2 in the plant, the number 1 in any business, not just this particular large factory, was always a member of the Communist Party. And the only reason they got that job is because they're a member of the Communist Party, knew nothing about textiles, knew nothing about running a business. So it was my father's job to deal with the technical aspects of it. But of course, the communist managing director tried to interfere and tried to tell my father what he ought to be doing and not doing. So life was quite tough and quite difficult. We had a good life, and we what was good was we kind of had the run of the place. We had to get home by a particular time, but during the day we were allowed to go around the streets with our friends and do all sorts of mischievous things, and that was acceptable because there was no scare of having children in the streets. During the revolution, I remember going to a place. It was a major ministry about a mile from where we lived, and outside it were tanks, and on it were the students who caused the revolution. And we went to see it, and we sort of touched the tanks and saw the tanks because we had the freedom of the city. So yeah, we did have a good life, and we grew up well.
Was there not a fear, coming from the fact it was after the war and so many of the Hungarian Jews had been slaughtered? Was there not a fear to stay in Budapest? I mean, didn't all the other remaining Jews want to go?
I would have to ask my father about this. A lot of our relatives and some of our friends or their friends left Hungary in the late 40s when there was an opportunity to do so. My parents chose not to do it. So when the revolution came along and an opportunity came along in 56, 57, they applied for a passport. They didn't just walk through the border as many other people did. They decided, they applied for a passport, which meant that they were able to take some of their belongings out the country. They had to give bribes to customs officials to let them take out rugs, china, bits of jewelry, which they're able to take out of Hungary. So when we left, it wasn't one of these cases which happened to many people where all we had was the stuff on our backs. Life was a bit better.
But why was there a revolution in Hungary in 1956, 57?
Well, I don't spend a lot of time talking about the politics. Basically, there was opposition to the Russian attempt at controlling the Hungarian government, and the Hungarians managed to oppose the Russian-controlled Hungarian government, and they were doing very well until the Russians invaded with tanks and soldiers and took back control. There was discontent because there was not enough Hungarian control of the economy. Anything that was worthwhile in terms of machinery, in terms of factory, had been stolen and exported to Russia. And so the Hungarian economy, the agriculture product was exported to Russia. So any wealth that might have been created or developed in Hungary was taken away by the Russians. In simple terms, that's the reason for the revolution.
So, your parents were very brave. Your dad was older than your mum, 12 years older than your mum, but your dad was 50 when they chose to leave their homeland, which is quite significant, really. And so they had you. How old were you when you left Hungary?
Well, this is 1957. I was 10 years old.
10 years old, and Peter was
12.
12, and did they come to Britain first of all, or?
Let me just go back a couple of steps. Let me talk through the process of how we left Hungary, because I think that's important. As I said, we were more or less, we had the freedom of the city. We could travel on the trams, we could travel on the buses, we'd go and see family, we could go swimming with friends. My parents were cautioned. Life was quite different. For example, when they went out rarely in the evening to friends, we'd be given the friends' phone numbers, but left to look after ourselves. We didn't have babysitters in Hungary. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't fashionable. It was just different. And basically, we were due to go on a train to Vienna, and it had been booked. Now, in those days in Hungary, it was fashionable for kids to have these hats, and I still have mine from 1957, and had one made in Hungarian colours, red, white, and blue. And I'd ordered this hat because I wanted a souvenir, and went off to collect it, which nearly made me late for this train. So you can imagine my parents nervous at the train station, waiting for me. And of course I turned up in good time and couldn't understand what the fuss was about. Why were they worried? Of course, I'm 10 years old. Of course I'm going to turn up on time, which I did. And we came by train to Vienna. And we got a visa to enter Austria, but we didn't have a visa to go on from Austria. In order to arrive in any country, to be allowed into any country, you had to have a sponsor, a guarantor. And my father had a friend. And this is interesting. This man had been an acquaintance of my father's. They belonged to the same rowing club. And he emigrated to Melbourne in Australia. And we were due to go there. And he changed his mind, and he wasn't prepared to give a guarantee to a family of 4, as you can imagine. Yeah, that's a fair amount of guarantee. So we weren't able to go to Australia. We then applied to go to Canada. And we were fortunate that my mother's cousin, Tibor Vandor, who helped them get into the Wallenberg house, had emigrated to Canada and was doing reasonably well. And he lent my parents some money, which of course they repaid fairly quickly, which meant that we were able to survive in Vienna. And
but then did you go to Canada?
We applied to go to Canada and we were turned down.
Why?
My father was 50 years old. He, his skills were not recognized sufficiently for the Canadian government to let us in. We were very, 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 very lucky in that one of my parents' friends who shared the Swedish house with them had come to London, and these two ladies had a brother who ran a very small leather goods and handbag shop in Cricklewood. And this man was a very nice old man. I would think he was in his 60s then. And, they weren't doing very well. They had a small flat, they had a small business. Believe it or not, they did agree to give a reference and a guarantee for a family of 4. I've often thought today that if somebody came to me who was a distant friend's relative, would I give that kind of guarantee for anybody?
Immigration?
And we were very lucky that they did that. We spent about, I think it's 3 or 4 weeks in Vienna. And during that time, my cousin Gabi and Mickey came through Vienna. And incidentally, the reason that I can remember some of these stories, because I'm fortunate to have available my diary, which I wrote in my own handwriting in 1957, and also my brother's diary for a similar period, which kind of gives you an aspect.
Do you have it with you?
I have it with me, and it's all in Hungarian. It's written in my own beautiful handwriting. Anni néni és Herman bácsi autóval elhozta Grazba, ahol egy édes házunk van. Este puha ágyban nem volt nehéz elaludni. 1957, March the 16th. Anni néni and Herman bácsi took us in their car to Graz, and they showed us their lovely little house. Este, in the evening, the soft bed was wonderful, and it wasn't difficult to fall asleep. In my own beautiful handwriting, and I'm quite proud of it. But it kind of reminds me of the things that we did. As I said, part of my parents' family, my father's family, came from Austria, and we had some distant relatives.
Was that the Deutsch?
That's a Deutsch and Neumann part
Deutsch
of the family.
and Neumann
mainly
was
the
your
Neumanns.
father's line.
The Neumanns were Austrians. And we had a distant relative who lived in Graz, who had been to Hungary, and we'd met them, and they came and picked us up and took us to Graz, and we stayed there for a few days. And from there we went off to have a look at a schloss, a castle, in a little town called Wies. Now, it didn't occur to me at the time to ask, what is if you like, by English standards, a middle-class family doing with a schloss? So a few years ago I said to my cousin, how come we had a schloss? because we didn't have it for very long. And I knew we didn't have it a long way back. He said, well, yes, one of your uncles won it in a card game. And that's how we had a Schloss. So we went to see that. And I remember travelling from Graz to Wies. And clearly somebody had agreed to give us a lift. But we had on our laps boxes of one-day-old chicks, which we had to take with us. So those are my memories. So when we got back to Vienna, my grandmother arrived, Shumi.
Your mother's mother, then.
My mother's mother arrived, and she was on the way to America, and she eventually ended up in America. I'll talk a little bit more about that further down.
Okay.
My grandmother was a very difficult woman. She was an incredibly good cook, but that was her only good side. She didn't like my father and made it clear. She made it clear to everybody what she thought, regardless of her position.
So she got packed off to Colorado, was it? She went to Colorado, and your family then got the thumbs up to come to England,
yes,
to London. Was the Catholic Church involved in that at all?
No, the Catholic Church wasn't. We didn't, we were christened before we left Hungary. But I'm not aware that we applied to the Catholic Church for any support. We certainly didn't get it as far as I know. But we then it was decided that we could come to London. We had all our visas and we were coming by train. And we came by train from Vienna to London. In Brussels, my parents' best friends were living. And they came on the train and came with us on a journey to Ostend. And so we saw them. We arrived in Ostend, and we got on the ferry. Well, it was the windiest, coldest, wettest day you can imagine. And of course, we're all sick as dogs. I remember that very well. I've not been on that crossing very often since. But we arrived in Dover, and we got on the train. And my mother spoke a little bit of schoolboy English. My father didn't, and of course we didn't either. And my mother had 2 and 6pence, which was quite a lot of money in 1957, and said to the train guard, can we get some tea for this? And he said, no, it's not enough. Well, a cup of tea, we found out afterwards, about 12.5p. But he didn't like the look of us, so we didn't get any tea.
Were you welcomed when you got to London?
We were treated incredibly well. We were supported by the WVS, who gave us furniture, who gave my father a suit, who gave us clothes. We were offered a council house in Palmer's Green, which we didn't take up. We were also helped a great deal by a lady from the British Council, who was very good to us. And when we arrived in London, she helped my father get a green card, which meant that he could work. And I remember we lived in Cricklewood when we first arrived, in this tiny, tiny room, just about big enough for the 4 of us.
One room.
And with shared bathroom, where I remember in the shared bathroom the ceiling collapsed, and there must have been cooking facilities, but not much.
How did your father cope if he didn't speak any English?
His first job, my father took the attitude that said he will always work. My father was never out of work. He never, ever, ever, ever claimed any kind of benefit. Of course, he took healthcare, but he never claimed unemployment benefit or housing benefit or any of the things which were around. Not because he wasn't entitled to it, but because he felt that he wanted to look after his own family. And within the first week, he got a job sorting rags.
Wow.
And it wasn't a great job, and it didn't last very long, and he got a better job later. But the room that we're in was in Cricklewood. And I still remember to this day, standing in front of the Crown in Cricklewood, which is still there, and the double-decker bus arriving. And the road in those days was cambered, so the bus is kind of leant as it came up alongside. And I was petrified.
But you'd never seen a double-decker bus?
Well, I'd never seen a double-decker bus, and I'd never seen a double-decker bus that leant at all. Yeah, so
But it sounds as if you were welcomed when you came to where did you go to school then? Because neither of you spoke
we were
English.
welcomed, as I say, by a number of organisations, and we had a few friends and relatives in London who were very good to us. My father's schoolboy friend was Pani Kertes, who was the head housekeeper at the Washington Hotel in Mayfair, and she came with us to the immigration office and got his green card and helped us to settle down. And we through another distant relative, she lived in Swiss Cottage and got us both into the Hall School in Swiss Cottage, which is one of the poshest primary schools there was in London.
What, and neither of you spoke any English?
Neither of us spoke any English. We spoke a modest amount of German, but that was it. But we were fortunate that Peter played the violin and they took us in. Well, on day one they tried to teach us German, Latin, French and English at the same time. Guess what? I didn't do very well. So they chucked me after about a month or 6 weeks, and I got sent to the local primary school, which was perfectly okay. They kept Peter on because they liked his violin playing, and there were people who remembered him 50 years later as playing at every concert, every end of term event, and they got to hate his violin playing. But he was fortunate as a result of this. He was recognised by a charity, the Buttle Trust, who gave him a grant and sent him off to Ampleforth in Yorkshire.
That's a Catholic boarding school.
The Catholic boarding school.
But your mother became a Catholic in England, or had she become a Catholic when she was still in Hungary?
She became a Catholic still in Hungary because it was considered in those days that might save her if somebody asked, because she then had a Catholic past.
You mentioned that caused a problem with some of the other Hungarian immigrants when you came to London.
A lot of the Jewish friends didn't like this, thought it was wrong. You know, they although they did the same thing, they reverted. And left it at that. But I was just going to talk about Peter's violin playing. At the Hall School, there must have been somebody from the BBC who heard him play, and he did play it well. And he got invited to play on BBC Children's Radio. So I think it was in 1958, we went along there to Broadcasting House, and we went up to the commissionaire. You remember the Corps of Commissionaires with their sort of belts and what have you, and big white hats. And of course, Peter's name was on the list, and they said, yeah, that's fine. And they said to me, who are you? So I said, well, I'm his manager and page turner. So they let me in as well. And that was a claim to fame. Peter had a fairly tough life at the beginning of Ampleforth. He lived in a house run by a Polish woman about, I don't know exactly, 5 miles away. So I had to ride there every day on his bike. And he had fairly serious asthma. And one way was uphill, one way was downhill. They were kind of treated as second-class citizens. There were a lot of snobs at Ampleforth.
Well, he was a scholarship boy.
He was a scholarship boy. So he made sure when his boys grew up that they went to Ampleforth too. And they were treated like first-class citizens. Not only, of course, did Peter pay, but he got involved in various aspects of the school. So he was very well connected. Peter was taught French by the late Cardinal Hume, and got involved in some of the other activities of the school.
What about your own schooling?
Well, I went to school, local prep school in Swiss Cottage, and that was fine. And then I went to a brand new secondary school opened. By then we were living in Cricklewood.
What was it called?
The school, the school was called the John Kelly School. Basically, I had to walk across Gladstone Park twice a day. It was a fair old walk. But I became a prefect in the 3rd year. I remember I stuck my tongue out in the school photograph. And the school photograph was taken on one of these cameras which panned from left to right. And I thought the camera had gone by, and the camera hadn't gone by. So I ruined the whole school photograph with my tongue sticking out. So I remember being caned by the housemaster.
But you told me about being a scout. That and many of your happiest memories, it seems to be, were when you were a Boy Scout.
I want to go back to Vienna because that was a momentous time. I skipped over some of the things. What my father did was to take the opportunity to show us around as much as he could. We lived in a small hotel and the four of us shared a room. And it's possible some other relatives stayed with us because they all came through Vienna. My cousin Gobby and Mickey came through. They were staying in a camp, a lager, before being allowed to go to Canada. My grandmother arrived. She might have stayed with us. But it was very near the very famous wheel called the Riesenrad, which is still there as far as I know in Vienna, and is still famous. But we went around Vienna. We went to the Stephankirche. We might have even shared a piece of cake in some of the famous bakeries and what have you. I remember going out to Schönbrunn and having a look around there. And I remember going to Grinzing and being incredibly cold because there was a snowstorm in beginning of April, which we weren't expecting. So, Vienna was a difficult time, and my parents must have been very worried because they didn't know what would become of us. They had limited amount of funds, but I don't remember ever them passing on their worries to us. My father would always eat, when we went into a restaurant, the cheapest thing on the menu, and to make sure that the money went as far as it could. And we walked fairly long distances, and I'm quite sure that we complained, but we had several relatives in Vienna and they were quite good to us.
Okay.
And it was a good time. I really think that was, if you like, a life-changing period in my life, because if we hadn't been accepted into the UK and been given the opportunity which we all have, which I'll talk a little bit further on, our life would not have been as good. My parents were always patriotic. They loved England, they loved London, and they never missed an opportunity to tell people about it. My mother learned to speak English well. My father didn't. Nevertheless, he got a job selling textiles and managed to find a combination of charm and technical knowledge to earn enough money to support us and support himself.
I have a question for you because I've looked at your family history and it always refers to your father and your family name as Deutsch. When did you become John Dietrich?
My father decided in the 40s to change his name to in Hungarian it's called Detre, because it was more acceptable in Hungary. Deutsch, of course, means German and was unpopular after the war. So he thought it was more, it's like the royal family changed their name to Windsor. It's the same kind of thing. Okay. Let me just go a little bit back to sort of when we first arrived in England. My cousin Andrew was already in London, and his parents arrived soon after, as his sister Vera. When they first arrived, for the first few days, they shared the room that we had in Belsize Park, which was a very large room, but there was an awful lot of us. Soon afterwards, my aunt Dushi also arrived. And
this was your mother's sister?
My mother's aunt.
Your mother's aunt?
My mother's aunt Dushi, whose husband had brought up my mother and her siblings.
Right.
And the husband died, and Dushi came to live with us and looked after us while my parents went out to work.
Your mother went out to work as well as your father?
Yes.
What did she do?
Basically, even in Hungary, my mother had been a dental nurse. In Hungary, she worked with my uncle, Zoltán Frankl, Andrew's father. And in Hungary, she did the same thing. And my father, as I say, worked for a textile company, which was owned by a Hungarian.
In London?
In London. And he worked there for quite a long time.
Okay.
And they were making jersey fabrics. And so my aunt Dushi looked after us, prepared our suppers, She was a lovely lady, and I would imagine I'd need to work out her exact age, but I imagine she was in her 60s, didn't speak a single word of English, and she'd watch television, and she'd tell you the whole story because she invented it. She had no idea what was going on.
So she lived with you when you were growing up as a child?
Yes.
What other memories are significant for you in that period, coming to England, being at school, joining the Scouts, going on holiday?
We clearly we had to learn to speak very quickly, to speak English very quickly, and in roughly the first week, we walked from Cricklewood to Gladstone Park, which isn't a great distance, about half a mile or a mile, and Peter loved football, was mad about football all his life, and he'd learned this one phrase, which was, "Can I play with you?" So, of course, they let him play football. He was playing football. I got bored with watching football. But I'd been given a pair of roller skates. I'd been given a set of roller skates by the gentleman, Mr. Molnar, who guaranteed us. I'd been helping out in his leather shop, tidying up and doing errands and this and the other. And as a gift, he bought us a pair of roller skates. So I rode this roller skate back from Gladstone Park to Cricklewood. And of course, the pavements were cambered. I broke my ankle. So within 2 weeks of arriving in England, we were in hospital getting my leg plastered, and it was my first experience of the NHS.
Wow.
Short time later, we moved into Oman Court in Cricklewood, which is still there today, and we had a reasonable flat. And opposite the block of flats, about 100 yards away, was a scout hut. And I went down there and joined the Scouts. And that was an important part of my life. I was a scout for quite a long time, enjoyed it very much. But most importantly, I found out a great deal about the English way of life. I remember going camping, for example, and they used brand new washing up bowls to make trifle for the whole scout troop. And I was a patrol leader and enjoyed the Scouts very much, and went to the Scout Jamboree in Greece.
How old were you when you did that?
I think I must have been about 17 or 18, 16 or 17.
Well, how did you afford that?
Well, what happened was my parents' friend, Pani Kertes, and her friends had bought a small hotel in Bayswater, and I worked there as a porter on Sunday afternoons and earned the money to pay for the trip to Greece, which was extortionate amount. If you think we're talking about the very early 70s, the charge for this trip was £80 a head, which even today is money. Somebody must have got rich on the back of taking these boys to Greece. And we were in a place called Marathon, just outside of Athens, and we went to Rhodes, and it was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful holiday. But in the early period of when we arrived, the summer after we arrived, the Lions from Brighton invited a number of Hungarian refugee children to spend a holiday there. And we went down there for 2 weeks. We stayed in a family in Lewis, who were very good to us, and every day they took us out, and we met the mayor of Brighton, and they took us to the pavilion, and they took us to the zoo, and they took us to the seaside, and treated us very, very well indeed. And these and a few other things made me want to always put back into society, because if it wasn't for those people who'd clearly paid for us, if it wasn't for the extraordinary scout leader who took me and patiently helped me get started and learn English way of life and learn about English food, and took us camping every year. We went to places like Jersey, and we went on holiday to Monmouthshire and South Mimms.
Monmouthshire and South Mimms.
Well, there was a scout campsite there.
So you got to learn more about England, and your father loved the English, and although you said
throughout his whole life he loved the English and the English way of life. In the 70s and in the 80s, when Hungary was still under communist control, whenever anybody that he knew came to London, they'd look him up and He would take them out and show them Buckingham Palace and the Tower of London, and he was extraordinarily proud of living in London and the treatment that we'd all received as a family. And I'm quite sure that he didn't regret for one single minute leaving Hungary and coming to London. Life was yes, it was tough. For him to go out selling was very difficult because his English was modest. But, they ended up with a nice house in Cricklewood, which they bought in about 68, 69. It was a comfortable 3-bedroom house in which I lived.
You said he took up gardening.
My parents took up gardening. It was a nice, ordinary suburban semi-detached house. And my mother would plant things and my father would pull them up because he didn't know the difference between weeds and flowers. So that caused a degree of contention between them. But it was fortunate that they lived together in harmony into his 90s. In the last few years, they managed to get some women out from Hungary who stayed with them and looked after them and nursed them a little bit. So they were able to stay. My father was taken to a hospital and moved straight from his home, sadly, to the hospital where he died. So he never ended up in a nursing home. He was only in hospital for a short time.
Okay. I want to move you on now a little bit because you say your father and mother never regretted coming to London, but you went and tried out living in Canada when you were in your late teens, didn't you, early 20s? And decided to come back because you missed London and your parents too much.
Before we cover that, and I'll gladly come back to it, let me just go back a little bit. My grandmother, known to everybody as Shumi, was a difficult woman. Her only claim to fame was she was a very good cook. But she was difficult, she was critical, she told everybody what she thought, and she told everybody regardless of whether she was right or wrong. She didn't like my father. From Vienna, she went to live with her daughter in Denver. Of course, she didn't speak any English, and my Aunt Susan and her husband were living comfortably with their one son, and my grandmother came along and tried to tell them how to live their life. And one day we had a phone call in London say, your mother's on a plane, pick her up from Heathrow, and she'll be there at 3 o'clock this afternoon. So we had to go and pick her up because the Americans had chucked her out. The American family had chucked her out. To be fair, throughout her whole life, my grandmother was supported by her son and daughter from America, but they didn't want to live with her. So she ended up living in rented rooms.
I guess she couldn't live with you because her sister was already living
Exactly.
with you.
And she didn't get on with my father, and my father wouldn't have her and just wouldn't have her in the home. But she had a pretty good life in London.
Okay, so you went to Canada, you decided to come back, you visited the American relations while you were there.
Whoa. Let's just go back a step. I decided, like everybody at the age of 20, that I want to see the world. So I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll go and work in America. So I knocked on the door of the American embassy and said, excuse me, can I get a visa to work in America? And they said, you can, you have to immigrate. And you need to understand that within 3 months you'll be called up to go and fight in Vietnam. So I thought, well, maybe that's not what I want. So then I went and knocked on the door of the Canadian embassy and said, excuse me, can I play with you? Can I come to Canada? They said, yeah, that's fine, that's no problem. My cousin Gobby, who was involved in textiles, got me a job with a tiny little clothing manufacturer. And so I went back to the embassy and said, look, I've got a job in Montreal, but I only have 3 months to get there. So they processed my whole visa very, very fast and arrived in Montreal. And I shared a flat with my cousin Gobby, who I still think is as one of my best friends, who was extraordinarily good to me. And what happened was, he and a group of friends hired a ski chalet. And every weekend we spent in the ski chalet. And there'd be 10 of us, and we'd cook, and there'd be parties. I was never a good skier, but I loved the social life, all thanks to Gobby and to some extent his brother Mickey. I then went to work for a very large clothing manufacturer. And this clothing manufacturer had a factory in the middle of Quebec. and they had a massive flood in their warehouse. They said, would I go and work there? So I went there to help sort out the stuff that got damaged. And it was the greatest place I've ever been, because there were a ratio of something like 3,000 women to a few hundred men. So there I was, like a kid in the sweet shop, at the age of 21, in Victoriaville in Quebec. And life was good. I enjoyed life in Montreal. So I had a decision to make after nearly 2 years. Do I stay in Canada, for which I was entitled because I was a landed immigrant? I decided I preferred to live in London. My parents were here, my brother was here, other relatives were here. So I decided to come back to London, and I've never regretted it.
Okay. So you came back and you joined the Young Conservatives, which was a bit of a marriage market, I understand.
It's one of those things where you used to say, what am I going to do for a social life? I was a bit interested in politics, and I thought Young Conservatives would suit me well, and I went along to the Young Conservatives, and eventually I became the branch chairman, and some of the people I got involved in there are still friends of mine. People like Bob Lacey, who'd been my friend for a long time back and introduced me, and Paul Greek and Richard Grossman. They're still friends of mine all that time later. But the thing that was the most important thing about the Young Conservatives, it was a marriage market. And Simone came along. She lived very close to where we met in Willesden Green. And one of the people I died recently asked her out, and she turned him down. And I asked her out, and she accepted, and the rest is history.
So Simone Sims became your wife.
Simone Sims became my wife.
Very exotic roots.
She had a very interesting roots, in that her parents were from Alexandria, but of Greek origin. So they consider themselves Greek. So if you look at my two sons, Greg and Adam, they have the whole of Europe running through their veins. A bit of Greek, bit of Hungarian, bit of Austrian, bit of Czech, quite a mixture.
You didn't mention probably your oldest friend who you met at the Young Conservatives.
The other person I met at the Young Conservatives before I went to Canada was Richard Cantor. And we became friends in the mid-60s and stayed friends for 50 years till he died sadly last year. We were close friends, and ostensibly we had little in common, but we became very close friends. We went on lots and lots of family holidays, and we went on holidays before we married, with our wives and our children, and afterwards when he and I both divorced our respective wives.
I wanted to touch upon something you mentioned earlier, which was that you've always wanted to give something back, and you've got quite a career in volunteering and unpaid working and so forth. But before I talk about that, was it Richard who introduced you to Freemasonry, because you are a Freemason?
No, I introduced him, but I'll come back to that. In terms of putting back, I got involved in local politics, and I then decided I'd become a councillor, which at that stage wasn't a paid position. So it's something that I did, and I was fortunate in that Simone supported me through the campaign and supported me looking after children while I went out to meetings in the evening.
And she was working as well.
She was working as well,
but
she was a very good mother and looked after her children and understood why I was doing what I was doing. I've always believed that I want to put back. That's why I got involved in politics. I did a number of things. I was chairman of a police liaison committee set after the riots in Brixton, and I chaired that.
Did you? I understand you had to go and talk to the rioters at one point.
Well, what happened was 3-4 years after Brixton, this drug dealer had been arrested by the police. They held him down, and he died. And he was held at Notting Hill Police Station, and his friends went to complain. And the police weren't prepared to do anything about it. They laughed at them. So they then decided that they were going to have a march from Stonebridge to Notting Hill. And I went to the start of the march.
At Stonebridge.
At Stonebridge. Saw about, 100 people march off. Got in my car, drove down to Notting Hill, hid my car several streets away, because I never knew what was going to happen, and went there and stood with the police. And these people arrived, as I say, there are 100, and they're not terribly violent. And so they arrived, and they didn't know what to do next. So after a while, they started chucking empty plastic bottles, which they'd picked up along the way with Coke and lemonade in. And the police said to me, "You're the chairman of the police committee, you talk to them." Well, I have to tell you, the adrenaline started pumping, and I remember to this day picking up this mic, and the mic was linked to two very large speakers on top of the police station, and I was standing there alone, and opposite me were 100 people, not terribly happy by that, but they were not bad people. And I said to them, you've made your protest, you've made your speech, you've behaved decently, don't ruin it. And I talked to them like this for a few minutes, and they turned and went back. So I stopped a riot. Well, unfortunately, I then gave an interview to the Evening Standard, who totally misrepresented what I said and implied that I was critical of the whole thing, which I wasn't. So a week later, there was a meeting of the police committee in a church in the middle of Stonebridge, about a mile from where this estate is. And they walked in with a great big banner saying John Dietrich is a liar. Well, sitting me was sort of all the heads of police. And they knew this was coming, and they said, should they stop it? I said, you can't stop it. And I walked up to them. And this is a group of black guys, on average of 6'2" high. And they kind of stood all around me. And they were slightly intimidating, but they were not unpleasant, they were not threatening. But you can imagine the stress that I was under. I passed out. And I said to the police, they didn't touch me. They didn't hurt me. It was just, the adrenaline got too high. So I ended up in hospital and then went back. And that's the end of that story. Nothing happened.
Well, your volunteering certainly seems to have got you into some sticky situations, because well, we're still talking about volunteering. You have volunteered to teach in Africa from your current role teaching at the University of Westminster, and you've taught the children of the survivors of the genocide in Rwanda, as well as teaching in Tanzania, and paid for yourself to go every summer to go and teach these people, and you've had a few hair-raising experiences there too.
Well, the point is, I'm very fortunate, in the story that I've told you, that I lived a life in a good, decent family with all the opportunities, surrounded by warmth and love, in a comfortable home, with decent education, decent health care.
You have
the children of the genocide victims in Rwanda, at best had one parent. They needed supporting. So I got involved through the Conservative Party in Project Umubano, and went there 6 times to teach the children, and using teaching skills that I learned from the University of Westminster. I got involved and enjoyed it very much. This last year I went to Tanzania because we decided that the project in Rwanda had come to an end. But I just want to step back a little bit. I've always been interested in the NHS, and I tell people I've worked on 3 sides of the NHS. I sold to the NHS. I was chairman of the Health Authority, and got to understand it very well. And I was fortunate enough to be elected chairman of the Health Authority for Brent and Harrow, which was a modestly paid job. But it meant that I was able to influence the way the NHS has worked.
Let's talk about the NHS for a moment, because you are facing a bit of a health crisis at the moment, and all the volunteering that you've done for the NHS and so on is coming back to you now when you see it in action and see the people who are treating you and the extraordinary professionalism of the team. Do you want to just say a couple of words about that at this point?
Yes. I'm over 71. I was in pretty good health, and managed to grow old fairly well with the odd creaks and the odd bangs, but nothing serious. So we got to a situation where last year I was having problems, and they said, it's nothing, it's a bit of acid reflux. Well, they ran lots and lots and lots and lots of tests. They then found that I've got a tumour in my esophagus. So the consultant who found it at St Mark's Hospital sent me off and said, the man you need to see is Professor Hannah at St Mary's. And this was at the end of August in 2018. And I phoned up Professor Hannah's secretary and said, I need an appointment, blah, 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 blah. And they said, we can give you one in November. So I said, to hell with that. So I phoned up Professor Hannah's private office in where he has his private practice, and asked for an appointment. Got one the following evening, went to see him, and he was extraordinarily helpful, sympathetic, and at the end of the consultation, which Susie and I had, and I do want to talk about Susie because I haven't touched on Susie, I stood up, walked out the room with him, and turned to his secretary and said, what do I owe you? And he turned around and said, you owe me nothing, you're a member of the family. Because I'd been chairman of a health authority, he chose not to charge me.
And it's actually Professor Hannah who's doing a major operation on you next week, all going well. So, yes, that's
I haven't talked a great deal about my wonderful sons, but I really want to touch on something totally different. 2 years ago, I met an amazing woman, which has changed my life. 2 years ago, I met Susie Clark, who has brought warmth, friendship, love, affection into my life. Along with her came her 3 daughters, her 7 grandchildren, who treated me extraordinarily well and have
Don't forget my son-in-laws.
And wonderful son-in-laws as well.
Only because one of them beats you at backgammon, you're just cutting them out.
For the record, and I do mean for the record, I always beat him, but they are extremely good to me. I love spending time with the children, but I really appreciate the support, the kind of help that somebody as loving as Susie can give.
Thank you, Jani. But I'd also like you to, while we're drawing this to a close, mention some of your very dear friends, and then you can finish by talking about your boys, because they are great chaps. But you've got Peter's family now, because sadly you lost your brother 8 years ago, and his wonderful wife Sue you're very close to, and his boys Mark and Tom and Simon and their children. And in a way that's one of the reasons you're making this film, to tell the family history that maybe they don't know. And also your very dear friends that you haven't mentioned, who aren't Masons or Young Conservatives, but they're good chaps.
Yeah. There's, it's very difficult to praise a lifetime. It's 70 odd years.
You're
down
doing quite well.
to an hour, and to make it interesting. One of my hobbies has been Freemasonry since the early 70s. And I've made a lot of good friends through it. I'm still very active and very much involved. And I have friends who've been my friends for over 40 years, maybe 50 years. I mentioned my dear friend Richard Cantor, who also became a Freemason, Paul Greek, Ken Sinclair, Bob Lacey, Richard Grossman. Most of my friends are Freemasons.
Okay.
There are one or two who are not, people like Dave Sibley and Hugh Owen, but I forgive them for that.
And then there's your very special friend Peter Scott, who calls you every day.
Peter Scott is an interesting story. Peter Scott is a New Zealander, and we first got to know because I hired him, and then I got him another job. So I was his boss for a number of years. He and I have been friends since the early 80s, and he calls me every day to keep in touch. A very good friend, and life would be much harder without it.
Absolutely. And you have one very special friend who's a childhood friend whose sister and you and Peter were all very good friends when you first came over from Hungary.
There are lots of people that I'm still friends with, keep in touch. I really want to finish.
Okay.
Just mentioning, I mentioned my wife Simone till we divorced, and my two wonderful sons, Greg and Adam. Adam in the Philippines, Greg in London. They have both been supportive, sympathetic, understanding. They are totally rounded individuals. Neither of them have ever collected any kind of benefit. All of them have paid their way, have lived their lives in a way that we as parents would want them to. There are stories to be told on how Greg got into haberdashers, but it's enough to say that both boys got into haberdashers, both got a good education. Greg then went on to get a first from Oxford and a PhD from Princeton, and has held his own because he's clever and capable. And Adam, who's much more artistic and creates amazing things in wood, and at the same time is involved in the management of a resort in the Philippines, loves life there, and I hope to go and visit him in the very near future.
Absolutely, and he sharpens all your chisels and sorts out your tool room, your own.
He has to,
carpentry
because
room.
he blunts them and he makes the dust, so he has to clear up afterwards.
You're very fortunate in the friends that you have, and on this health journey that you've had, some of them, like your friend Cree, have made you Hungarian goulash and brought it round. And when I met you 2 years ago, I was very struck by the quality of the friendships that you have maintained and the friendships that have endured, and the fact that I have a big family, a big, affectionate, noisy, boisterous family, and you seem to love the grandchildren very much, and you told me that that's something that you inherited, particularly from your dad, who loved children. So
my father loved children, and he loved to go to the park. Gladstone Park was always near where we lived, when all the time we lived in London. And he'd go up to strangers' children and chat to them and pat them, and I was petrified with the modern period that we live in, that people would misunderstand, whereas all he wanted to do was give affection. Sadly, I don't have any grandchildren of my own, but
Not
maybe
yet.
that'll happen in the future.
You have to have a chat to Sila.
But at the moment, it doesn't seem likely. So I enjoy Susie's grandchildren.
Yeah, you can borrow them any time you like. It's fine.
Good.
And I know all the other hobbies and interests, quite apart from your wood carving and so forth, that you, like me, you love going to the theatre. You mentioned in passing that you played the trumpet when Peter played the violin. You played the trumpet and you love jazz. You share my passion for Beatles music, which is probably a good thing. So you have you're a many-faceted person. Is there anything you would like to say to sort of round this film off that you haven't said already, do you think?
I hope that I've left some memories which might not be known to people. Some of the things I've talked about will be known to people, like Greg and Adam and my nephews, Tom, Simon and Mark, and my daughter-in-law, my late brother's ex-wife, Sue. But I hope that I brought in things that they've either forgotten.
Tell me a story about Peter. We haven't spoken very much about Peter, your brother.
I think that'll be for the next story. Maybe I'll do another video just on Peter, because it's a long story. He was a clever, hard-working, good-looking man, a good father, very much involved in many things. He was involved in different things from me. He was involved in music, orchestras, and he always ended up running them.
Would you say that at the end of his life that the two of you became closer as brothers, or?
Undoubtedly. When we were teenagers, we were not very good friends. As we sort of grew towards the last few years, when we both divorced, we became much closer, and we became each other's closest confidants.
I thought it was lovely when you told me that, and you also told me how very fond you were of your cousin Vero.
Sadly,
much
my
she
cousin
meant to
Vera,
you.
which we haven't touched on because, as I say, it needs another 2 or 3 hours to cover everything, was my cousin, and the only one that lived towards the end in London. Sadly, she died a few years ago of cancer, and she was somebody, again, I was very close to, and I miss her.
And she had children as well?
And she has 2 children. She has Anna and Misha, who are living in London and New York, and growing up to be great human beings. She would be very proud of them, and we all miss her, as we do of the many others.
And Andrew, he had children as well, who your
Andrew
lives
has
in
children as well.
California?
Andrew moved. Andrew's another long story, but he lives in California, and his 2 children have been very successful, Nicholas and Annabelle, and they live in California too, and have done very well indeed, and he's very proud of them. He became a grandfather in the last 6 months for the first time. I'm very fortunate that all my cousins, who are in their 80s, are doing very well indeed and are mentally alert, and from that point of view, the genes that I inherited are doing okay.
They're doing okay.
This tumour is something that has come along, and I hope to fight it and come out of it the other side and tell another story in another 5 years' time.
Let's hope so.
Thank you.